The Boundaries of Love. Grace Whitman sat at her kitchen table at 7 p.m., reading glasses perched on her nose as she carefully reviewed the Medicare statements scattered before her. At 65, her hands showed the wear of decades cooking, cleaning, caring, but they remained steady as she double-checked each line item. The hip replacement surgery scheduled for July had been a year in the making, and the remaining $7,000 out-of-pocket cost sat safely in a dedicated savings account she'd opened specifically for this purpose. The house around her hummed with the familiar sounds of evening routine. From the living room came the gentle murmur of the television where her husband Frank watched his evening news. And upstairs, the soft padding of little feet as 3-year-old Caleb played in his room. This had been their life for 3 years now, ever since they'd moved from their beloved Vermont home to help their son Eric and daughter-in-law Madison with childcare. Grace rubbed her aching hip absently. The pain had been getting worse lately, sometimes leaving her unable to stand up straight after a day of chasing Caleb around. The doctor had been clear without the surgery. Another fall could mean she'd never walk independently again. The thought sent a chill through her, but she pushed it aside. July wasn't far away now. "Grace, dinner smells amazing as always," Eric called out as he walked through the front door, loosening his tie. At 36, her son still had the same warm smile that had melted her heart as a child, though the stress lines around his eyes spoke to the pressures of modern life mortgage payments, a demanding job, a family to support. "Just leftovers from yesterday," Grace replied, though she'd actually spent an hour preparing his favorite pot roast. "Madison's working late again. Conference call with the Singapore office. You know how it is." Eric hung his jacket on the back of a chair, a habit that used to drive Grace crazy, but she'd learned to let go. Pick your battles. She'd learned, save your energy for what matters. "Grandma, Grandma!" Caleb's voice echoed down the stairs as small feet thundered toward the kitchen. Grace's face lit up as her grandson launched himself into her arms, nearly knocking her off balance. "Easy there, little man." She laughed, wincing slightly as the movement jarred her hip. "Did you have a good day with Mommy?" "Mommy was on the computer all day. She said I was too loud." Caleb's bottom lip pushed out in a pout that was pure Eric at that age. Grace exchanged a glance with her son, who shrugged apologetically. Madison worked in international marketing, which meant calls at all hours. But Grace couldn't help feeling that a 3-year-old shouldn't have to tiptoe around his own home. As they sat down to dinner, Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, Eric calling. But Eric was right there at the table. She looked up, confused, then realized the call was coming through the landline. "I'll get it," Eric said, reaching for the phone. "Hello? Oh, hey, Madison. What's up?" Grace watched her son's face change as he listened, his expression shifting from casual interest to surprise to something she couldn't quite read. He walked into the living room, voice dropping to a whisper. "Is Daddy in trouble?" Caleb asked, sensing the shift in atmosphere with the intuition children possess. "No, sweetheart. Daddy's just talking to Mommy about grown-up things." But Grace felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. The same feeling she'd had 3 years ago when Madison called crying, begging them to move in and help with the baby. Eric returned to the kitchen 10 minutes later, phone in hand, his face flushed with an emotion Grace couldn't identify: excitement, nervousness, guilt. "Mom, we need to talk." "Caleb, why don't you go play with your trains upstairs for a bit?" Grace suggested gently, though every maternal instinct was screaming that whatever Eric needed to discuss, she didn't want to hear it. Once they were alone, Eric sat heavily in the chair across from her, running his hands through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "Madison and I have been talking, and we've decided to take her parents to the Maldives next month, just for a week." You know how hard her father's been working, and her mother's been stressed about his retirement? We thought it would be nice to give them a real vacation before they get too old to travel. Grace felt the words hit her like cold water. The Maldives. It's this all-inclusive resort. Really beautiful. Madison found an amazing deal, and we just couldn't pass it up. Her parents have never been anywhere exotic, and we want to give them this experience while we can. That sounds lovely, Eric, but what about Caleb? And when you say next month, April 28th, we fly out early morning. Eric's words came faster now, as if speed could somehow soften the blow. And about Caleb, well, we were hoping you and Dad could watch him. You're so good with him, and he adores you both. It's really just a week. Grace set down her fork carefully, her appetite completely gone. Eric, my surgery is scheduled for July. I've been saving every penny for the medical expenses. Oh, about that. Eric's voice took on a strange, almost casual tone that made Grace's blood run cold. I used the medical fund card to book the flights and the resort deposit. It was the only way we could secure the dates. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. Grace stared at her son, certain she had misheard. You used what? The medical savings card. You said if I ever really needed money for something important, I could use it. And Mom, this is important. Madison's dad might not be able to travel much longer, and her mom has been so depressed since he retired. This trip could really help their relationship. And you know how much Madison's been struggling with everything. Eric, Grace's voice was barely above a whisper, but something in her tone made him stop talking immediately. That money was for my surgery, my hip replacement, the surgery I need so I can continue to walk. I know, but Mom, you can always reschedule. The doctor said it wasn't immediately life-threatening, right? And we'll pay you back as soon as we can. Madison's getting a bonus in the fall, and you took $7,000. $7,000 I saved over 14 months, without asking me. Frank appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension he could feel even from the living room. He took one look at Grace's face and knew their world had just shifted on its axis. What's going on? Frank asked quietly. Grace couldn't answer. She was remembering the emergency care authorization she'd signed last year when Madison had been hospitalized with severe postpartum complications. Grace had signed papers allowing her to make medical decisions for Caleb if needed. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable precaution. Now she wondered what else those papers might have authorized. Eric was still talking, his voice taking on a pleading quality. Mom, please try to understand. Madison's been under so much pressure at work, and her parents have done so much for us. They help with the down payment on the house. They buy Caleb's clothes. They help you because you're their daughter's family, Grace said slowly, each word deliberate. Just like we've helped you because you're our son. But Eric, there's a difference between helping and being taken advantage of. Nobody's taking advantage of anyone. Eric's voice rose, startling them all. We're family. Families help each other. Grace stood up slowly, her hip protesting the movement. She walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the small backyard where she'd spent countless hours pushing Caleb on his swing set. The swing set she and Frank had bought and assembled themselves. When you called to tell us Madison was struggling after Caleb was born, we didn't hesitate. We sold our house in Vermont, the house your father built with his own hands, and moved here to help. When you lost your job for 6 months, we gave you $50,000 from our retirement fund. When Madison decided she needed organic everything for the baby, I rode 3 buses to find the special stores that sold what she wanted. And when she criticized every meal I cooked, every way I held my own grandson, every decision I made about his care, I swallowed my hurt because I thought we were helping. She turned to face her son, and for the first time in 3 years, Eric saw something in his mother's eyes that he'd never seen before. Not anger, something colder. Clarity. But taking my surgery money, Eric, without asking, without even telling me until after you'd already spent it. Grace shook her head slowly. That's not family helping family. That's something else entirely. That night, Grace lay awake in the small guest room she and Frank had called home for 3 years. The room was cramped, barely large enough for their queen-sized bed, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence and curtains that never quite blocked out the streetlight. In Vermont, their bedroom had faced east, catching the morning sun across rolling hills. Here, the walls were thin enough that they could hear Madison's conference calls at all hours and Caleb's occasional nightmares. Frank was breathing heavily beside her, not quite snoring, but close. At 70, he'd aged visibly in the 3 years since they'd moved. The stress of city living, the cramped quarters, the constant tension with Madison, it had all taken its toll. Grace's mind wandered back to the beginning, to the phone call that had changed everything. Madison, crying hysterically, begging them to come help. I can't do this alone. Grace, I'm drowning. Caleb won't stop crying. And Eric's working 16-hour days. And I feel like I'm failing at everything. Please, I need you. I'll treat you like my own mother. I promise. Those first months had been hard but hopeful. Madison had been genuinely grateful then, hugging Grace with tears in her eyes, thanking her for saving their family. But somewhere along the way, gratitude had transformed into expectation, and expectation into entitlement. Grace remembered the first time Madison had criticized her cooking. Grace, this is way too greasy for a baby household. I've been reading about childhood obesity, and we really need to be more conscious about nutrition. She'd handed Grace a printed article and a list of approved foods, all organic, all expensive, many that Grace had never heard of. Then came the criticism of how she held Caleb, that position could affect his spinal development. How she dressed him. He's overheating cotton is better than wool. How she talked to him, baby talk can delay language development. Each critique came with a citation, a study, an expert opinion that supposedly validated Madison's corrections. Eric, caught in the middle, had developed a standard response. Mom, Madison just wants what's best for Caleb. She's read all the latest research. Can't you just try to be more understanding? Understanding. Grace had tried to be understanding when Madison reorganized the kitchen without asking, putting things in places that made no sense to Grace. She'd tried to be understanding when Madison instituted a quiet time policy that meant Grace couldn't vacuum or do laundry during certain hours. She tried to be understanding when Madison started buying expensive organic baby food instead of letting Grace make it fresh. Even though money was tight, the financial support had started small, 100 here, 50 there for diapers or formula, but it had grown, month by month, until Grace found herself regularly transferring money from their savings to Eric and Madison's account. The mortgage payments, the car loan, Madison's skincare products that cost more than Grace spent on groceries in a month. When Eric lost his job, Madison hadn't even asked directly. She'd simply called Grace crying, saying they were going to lose the house, that Caleb would have to grow up knowing his parents had failed. Grace had walked to the bank that afternoon and withdrawn $50,000 from their retirement account. Madison had hugged her and sobbed with gratitude. They'd never discussed repayment, and as the months passed, it became clear that none was expected. Grace thought about the papers she'd signed during Madison's health scare. She'd been so focused on helping, on being available for Caleb if something happened to his mother, that she'd signed whatever the lawyers put in front of her. Emergency custody authorization, medical decision-making power, financial responsibility for Caleb's care if needed. It had all seemed reasonable at the time. Now she wondered what else those papers allowed for. Could Madison have used them to access government benefits to claim Grace as a co-guardian for tax purposes? The knot in Grace's stomach tightened. Can't sleep. Frank's voice was quiet in the darkness. Just thinking. About the money. About everything. Grace turned onto her side to face her husband. In the dim light from the street lamp, she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. Frank, when did we stop being people and become resources? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. What are you thinking, Grace? I'm thinking, she said slowly, that it's time to go home. Grace woke at 5 a.m. on April 28th, the house still wrapped in pre-dawn silence. Through the thin walls, she could hear Madison's alarm clock buzzing in the master bedroom, followed by the hurried sounds of last-minute packing. Their flight to the Maldives wasn't until noon, but Madison had insisted on getting to the airport 3 hours early for an international flight. Grace had made her decision 3 nights ago, after another evening of watching Madison lay out resort wear while discussing how Grace should handle Caleb's meals, nap schedule, and bedtime routine. The final straw had been Madison's casual comment. Oh, and Grace, while we're gone, could you deep clean the baseboards in the living room? I've been meaning to get to them, but you know how busy things have been. Frank was already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who'd been thinking for hours. Today, he whispered, today. Grace confirmed. They'd spent the past 3 days quietly packing their belongings. Not everything that would have been too obvious, just the essentials, the irreplaceable items, the things that mattered most. Grace had carefully folded the quilt her mother had made for her wedding, the photo albums from Eric's childhood, Frank's woodworking tools. Everything else could be replaced or retrieved later. The suitcases were hidden in Frank's truck, parked around the corner at their neighbor Betty's house. Betty had asked no questions when Frank had explained they needed to store some things temporarily, just nodded and handed over her spare garage door opener. As Madison and Eric rushed around upstairs, Grace made breakfast with unusual care, pancakes from scratch, real maple syrup, fresh orange juice. If this was to be her last morning in this house, she wanted it to be peaceful. Grandma, are you sad? Caleb asked, sensing something different in the atmosphere as he always did. Children were like emotional barometers. Grace had learned, picking up on tensions adults tried to hide. A little, sweetheart, but sometimes being a little sad is okay. It means something is changing, and change can be good. Eric appeared in the kitchen, looking harried and excited in equal measure. He kissed Grace's cheek and grabbed a piece of toast. Mom, you're amazing. I don't know what we'd do without you. The irony wasn't lost on Grace. Have a wonderful trip, honey. Try not to worry about anything here. Madison swept into the kitchen in a whirl of expensive luggage and last-minute instructions. Grace, I've left detailed schedules for Caleb on the refrigerator. His pediatrician's number is there too, just in case. And please remember to use the organic detergent for his clothes. His skin is so sensitive. Of course, Grace said calmly. And if you could vacuum the stairs while he's napping, that would be great. I noticed they're looking a bit dingy. Madison checked her phone. Oh, and Eric, did you remember to tell your mom about watering the plants? The plants will be fine, Grace said. An hour later, Grace and Frank stood in the doorway watching the taxi pull away. Eric and Madison's excited voices carrying back to them through the open windows. Madison was already showing her parents photos of the resort on her phone, her voice bright with anticipation. Caleb waved from the window until the taxi disappeared around the corner, then looked up at Grace with the solemn expression he wore when processing big changes. Are they coming back, Grandma? Yes, sweetheart, in a week. Are we going to be here when they come back? Grace knelt down to meet his eyes, struck by the intuitive wisdom of children. I don't know, Caleb, but whatever happens, you're going to be okay. Do you understand that? He nodded seriously, then threw his small arms around her neck. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, little man, more than you'll ever know. By 10 a.m., Grace and Frank had collected their hidden suitcases and were sitting in the taxi that would take them to the train station. Grace didn't look back at the house as they pulled away. Some bridges, once burned, were meant to stay that way. The train to Vermont left at noon the same time Eric and Madison's flight was taking off. Grace found a poetry in that timing, a symmetry that felt like the universe offering its approval. As the landscape outside their window shifted from urban sprawl to rolling hills, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the possibility of peace. Grace and Frank had been home in Vermont for exactly 18 hours when Grace's phone rang. She was in the kitchen, cleaning windows that hadn't been properly attended to in 3 years, humming softly to herself as afternoon sunlight streamed across the familiar wooden floors. The sound of the phone was jarring in the peaceful silence. Madison's name flashed on the screen. Grace let it ring 4 times before answering. Grace? Madison's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. What exactly do you think you're doing? I'm cleaning my kitchen windows. What are you doing, Madison? Don't play games with me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You abandoned Caleb. You just left him there with no warning, no discussion, nothing. Do you have any idea how irresponsible that is? Grace set down her cleaning cloth and walked to the window that faced her garden, her actual garden, the one she'd planted and tended for 30 years before giving it up to help with Caleb. Madison, I need you to listen very carefully. Caleb is your son, not mine. I am not his primary caregiver, his babysitter, or his backup parent. I am his grandmother, and grandmothers get to choose when and how they spend time with their grandchildren. You can't just decide to leave. We had an arrangement. We had an arrangement where you took my surgery money without asking and expected me to provide free childcare while you vacation in the Maldives. That arrangement has been terminated. There was silence on the other end, followed by what sounded like Madison covering the phone and having a heated, whispered conversation with someone, probably Eric. Grace, you're being completely unreasonable. We're family. Families help each other through difficult times. You're absolutely right, Grace said, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. Families do help each other, which is why I'm confused about why you've never helped us through anything. When was the last time you asked how Frank's arthritis was doing? When was the last time you thanked us for the $50,000 we gave you when Eric lost his job? When was the last time you treated our home like it belonged to us too, instead of treating us like live-in staff? That's not we've always been grateful. Madison, gratitude isn't a feeling you express when it's convenient. It's an action you take every day. And taking my medical savings without permission isn't the action of someone who's grateful. Look, Madison's voice shifted, taking on a placating tone. I understand you're upset about the money thing. Eric probably should have asked first. But Grace, we're talking about Caleb here. He's just a little boy. You can't punish him because you're mad at us. Grace felt the familiar manipulation in Madison's words, the way she always managed to make Grace feel like the unreasonable one, the selfish one, the one causing problems. I'm not punishing Caleb. I'm teaching him something very important, that people who love you don't take advantage of you, and that adults are responsible for their own choices and their consequences. You're destroying our trip. We've already paid for everything. The flights, the resort, the excursions. Do you even understand what this is costing us? Yes, Grace said quietly. It's costing you $7,000 from my surgery fund. The line went quiet again. When Madison spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of politeness. Fine. You want to be selfish? You want to abandon your own grandson? Then we'll make other arrangements. But don't think this is over. Grace? Don't think you can just walk away from your responsibilities and expect everything to be fine when you decide you want to be a grandmother again. Grace hung up without saying goodbye. Frank appeared in the doorway, soil on his hands from working in the garden. That sounded pleasant? She's scared, Grace said. And people do ugly things when they're scared. You think she'll really make other arrangements for Caleb? Grace looked out at the garden where Frank had already started clearing 3 years' worth of weeds. I think Madison is about to learn what other arrangements actually cost. The call from Linda Ellis came that evening, just as Grace was settling down with a cup of tea and a book she'd been trying to read for 6 months. Frank was on the porch, smoking his evening pipe and watching the sunset paint the hills purple and gold. It was the kind of peaceful evening Grace had dreamed about during those long, tension-filled nights in Eric and Madison's guest room. Linda's voice was measured, professional, the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. Grace, this is Linda, Madison's mother. I think we need to have a conversation about this situation. Hello, Linda. How was your flight to the Maldives? There was a pause. We didn't go. Grace, obviously, we couldn't very well leave for a vacation when there was a family crisis happening. Grace felt a stab of vindication. So Madison had been forced to cancel their expensive trip, to disappoint her parents, to face the consequences of her assumptions. I'm sorry to hear that, though I'm not sure why there's a crisis. Eric and Madison are Caleb's parents. Surely they're capable of caring for their own child. Grace, let's not pretend this is about capability. This is about family obligation. Madison and Eric both work demanding jobs. They need support, and traditionally, that support comes from grandparents. Traditionally? Grace repeated. Linda, let me ask you something. How many months of your retirement savings did you contribute to Madison and Eric's mortgage? That's not. How many nights did you wake up with Caleb when he was teething? How many loads of laundry did you do? How many meals did you cook that Madison criticized for being too greasy, too salty, or not organic enough? Grace, you chose to help them. No one forced you. You're absolutely right. I chose to help. Past tense. Now I'm choosing to stop. Linda's voice sharpened. And what about Caleb? He's just a child. He doesn't understand why his grandmother suddenly decided she doesn't love him anymore. The words hit their target, and Grace felt the familiar twist of guilt in her chest. But this time, instead of giving in to it, she examined it. Where did this guilt come from? Who benefited from it? Linda, loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for them. It means wanting what's best for them. And what's best for Caleb is parents who are responsible for him, not grandparents who enable their irresponsibility. You're being incredibly selfish. Yes, Grace said, surprising them both. I am, for the first time in 3 years. I'm putting my own needs, my health, my marriage, my peace of mind first. And you know what? It feels wonderful. Madison grew up comfortable. Grace, she's not used to struggle. This transition to motherhood has been harder for her than it might be for others. Grace almost laughed. Linda, I didn't grow up comfortable. I was 19 when I had Eric, working 2 jobs while Frank was in school. I didn't have organic baby food and designer cribs and childcare books written by experts. I had common sense, determination, and the understanding that being a parent meant figuring it out as you go. Madison is 32 years old. If she can't figure out how to care for her own child by now, the problem isn't lack of support, it's lack of accountability. So you're just going to let them fail. I'm going to let them succeed or fail on their own merits, just like every other parent in the world. The conversation ended shortly after that, with Linda making vague threats about consequences and Grace feeling lighter than she had in years. That night, as she and Frank sat on their own porch, listening to the sound of night birds and distant train whistles, Grace's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she found a screenshot of a social media post from Madison's account. Sometimes you think you know someone, and then they show you who they really are. Heartbroken that people who claim to love you can be so cruel when you need them most. Praying for strength to protect my family from toxic influences. Hashtag family, hashtag betrayal, hashtag boundaries. Grace showed the message to Frank, who read it and shook his head. She's building a narrative, he said quietly. Let her, Grace replied. The truth doesn't need a marketing campaign. But as she went to bed that night, Grace found herself thinking about Caleb, wondering if he was scared, if he was asking for her, if he understood why his grandparents had suddenly disappeared from his life. The guilt was there, persistent as a low-grade fever, but underneath it was something stronger, the certainty that love without boundaries wasn't love at all, it was enablement, masquerading as devotion. David Carlisle had been Frank's roommate at the University of Vermont 45 years ago, and now he was a family law attorney with a practice that specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation. When Grace called him 3 days after returning home, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many similar stories. Grace, from what you're telling me, there are several concerning elements here. The use of your medical savings without consent, the emergency custody paperwork you signed, and the social media campaign. I'd like to see all the documents you signed when Madison was hospitalized. Grace had retrieved the papers from her files that morning, spreading them across her kitchen table with a growing sense of unease. The emergency custody authorization was more comprehensive than she'd remembered, granting her not just the ability to make medical decisions for Caleb, but also the authority to apply for government benefits on his behalf if needed. David, could these papers have been used to apply for state child care assistance? Absolutely. And if benefits were granted based on your income and assets rather than Eric and Madison's, that would constitute fraud. Grace, I need to ask you directly, have you ever received any government payments related to Caleb's care? No, never? Then we may have a problem. Let me make some calls. By evening, David had confirmed Grace's worst fears. Madison had indeed used the emergency custody papers to apply for state child care assistance, claiming that Grace was Caleb's primary caregiver due to Eric and Madison's work demands. The state had approved benefits totaling $800 per month, paid directly into an account that listed Grace as the primary beneficiary but was controlled by Madison. This is textbook benefit fraud, David explained during their second phone call. Madison used your legal status as emergency guardian to claim benefits she wasn't entitled to, while you had no knowledge of the application or the payments. What does this mean for Madison? If we report this and Grace, I strongly recommend that we do. She could face fines between $5,000 and $10,000, restitution of all benefits received, and a 5-year ban from receiving state assistance. It would also likely trigger an investigation by her employer. Since this type of fraud can be considered a violation of professional ethics in many fields, Grace felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. She'd raised Eric to be honest, to take responsibility for his actions. Where had she gone wrong? David, I want to file the report, but I want Madison to have a chance to make this right first. Can you send her a formal notification that we're aware of the fraud and give her 30 days to voluntarily withdraw the applications and return the money? Of course, but Grace, be prepared for this to get ugly. Once people feel cornered, they often lash out. David's prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. 2 hours after David's letter was delivered to Madison's office, Grace's phone rang. This time it was Eric, and he sounded desperate. Mom, what the hell are you doing? Madison's boss called her into a meeting today about irregularities in her personal affairs. She could lose her job over this. Eric, your wife committed fraud using my identity. What did you think was going to happen? It wasn't fraud. You signed those papers. You said we could use them if we needed help. I signed papers authorizing me to make emergency medical decisions for Caleb. I did not authorize Madison to apply for government benefits in my name. And even if I had, Eric, I was never told about these applications, never saw the money, never knew it existed. Eric's voice cracked. Mom, please, Madison made a mistake. Okay. She was overwhelmed. She thought the papers covered more than they did. Can't you just let this go? We'll pay back whatever money. Eric, stop. Grace's voice was firm. Just stop. Your wife didn't make a mistake. She made a calculated decision to use my legal status to fraudulently obtain money from the state. And instead of asking her to take responsibility for her actions, you're asking me to protect her from the consequences. She's my wife, and I'm your mother. But more importantly, I'm a person who deserves to be treated with respect and honesty, something your wife has failed to do. The line was quiet for a long moment. When Eric spoke again, his voice was small, defeated. What do you want from us? Mom, I want Madison to voluntarily withdraw her fraudulent applications, return all money received, and publicly acknowledge what she did. I want both of you to attend family counseling to learn how to communicate honestly, and I want you to take full responsibility for Caleb's care without expecting Frank and me to serve as your backup plan. And if we do all that, you'll drop the legal case. Grace looked out her kitchen window at the garden where Frank was planting tomatoes. The same garden where she'd taught Eric to distinguish between weeds and flowers 30 years ago. Eric, this isn't a negotiation. These are the natural consequences of your wife's choices. Whether you meet these conditions or not, my position remains the same. I will not be returning to your house. I will not be providing free childcare, and I will not be contributing financially to your household. You're adults. Act like it. Grace was weeding her herb garden on a sunny Thursday morning when her phone rang with a call from Eric. She almost didn't answer their conversation 3 days earlier, had ended with him hanging up on her after she'd refused to be reasonable about Madison's situation. But something in the timing of the call, mid-morning on a workday, made her pick up. Mom! Eric's voice was strained, exhausted. I need help. With what, Eric? Madison left yesterday morning. She dropped Caleb off at my office and said, your parents said he's your responsibility now, so you figure it out. She turned off her phone, and I haven't heard from her since. Grace felt her heart clench, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Where is Caleb now? He's with me. I took the day off work. But Mom, I don't know what I'm doing. He cried for 3 hours last night asking for you and Madison. I gave him cereal for dinner because I don't know what else he likes to eat. I don't know his bedtime routine. I don't know how to work the car seat properly. I don't even know which pediatrician to call if he gets sick. The helplessness in her son's voice broke Grace's heart, but it also crystallized something she'd been trying to ignore. Eric genuinely didn't know how to care for his own child. Not because he was incapable, but because he'd never been required to learn. Eric, what did you do for the 6 months before Frank and I moved in to help? That was different. Madison was handling most of it then, and when she couldn't, I called my mom. He paused. I called you. And now you're going to learn what every other parent learns, how to figure it out as you go. Mom, please. I'm not asking you to move back in. I'm just asking for help. Maybe you could take him for a few days until I can find a daycare that has an opening, or until Madison comes back. Grace closed her eyes, picturing Caleb's confused little face, imagining him crying for the only stable caregivers he'd known for most of his life. The urge to drive over there immediately, to scoop him up and bring him home where she could take care of him properly, was almost overwhelming. No, Eric. What do you mean? No. I mean no. Caleb is your son. You're going to learn to take care of him. Call in sick to work for the rest of the week. Take him to the grocery store and let him show you what he likes to eat. Ask him about his favorite books and toys. Spend time with him. Actually parent him. But I don't know. Eric, do you think I knew how to be a mother when you were born? Do you think any parent knows what they're doing? You learn by doing. You make mistakes. You figure out what works. You ask for help when you need it from pediatricians, from other parents, from books. But not from me. Not anymore. He keeps asking for you, Mom. He doesn't understand why you're not here. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She could picture Caleb's confusion, his little face crumpled with the incomprehensible pain of abandonment. But she also knew that stepping in now would only perpetuate the cycle that had brought them to this point. Then explain it to him in words he can understand. Tell him that Grandma and Grandpa love him very much, but that mommies and daddies are the ones who take care of children every day. Tell him that you're learning how to be the best daddy you can be. What if I mess up? What if I do something wrong? Then you'll fix it and do better next time. That's what parenting is. Eric, it's not about being perfect. It's about being present and responsible. The call ended with Eric in tears the first time Grace had heard her grown son cry since he was 12 years old and his dog died. But she didn't relent. Love, she was learning, sometimes meant allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences were painful to watch. 2 days later, David called with an update that made Grace's stomach drop. Grace, I've been monitoring the situation as you requested, and there's been a development. Caleb was taken to the emergency room yesterday evening with a high fever. Eric called 911 because he panicked when the boy's temperature spiked to 104. Is he okay? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. He's fine. Ear infection, very common in children his age. But Grace, the hospital staff noted that Eric seemed unfamiliar with basic child care procedures. He didn't know Caleb's medical history, didn't have insurance cards, couldn't answer questions about allergies or previous medications. Grace sank into a kitchen chair, her knees suddenly weak. Did they call social services? Not yet, but Eric's on their radar now. If there are any more incidents that suggest parental incompetence, they'll have to file a report. That evening, as Grace sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a text message from Eric. It was a photo of Caleb sleeping peacefully in his own bed, clutching the stuffed elephant Grace had given him for his second birthday. Underneath the photo was a single line, "Fever broke this morning. We're okay." Grace stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, "I'm proud of you for taking care of him." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, Eric's response came through, "It's harder than I thought." "Most important things are," Grace replied. Grace was transplanting seedlings in her greenhouse when she heard the car door slam in her driveway. Through the glass panels, she could see Linda Ellis marching toward her front door with the determination of a general leading a charge, Madison trailing behind her looking pale and defeated. Frank met them at the door, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Linda, Madison, this is unexpected. We need to speak with Grace immediately," Linda announced. "This situation has gone far enough. Grace set down her gardening tools and walked slowly toward the house, taking time to brush the soil from her hands. She wasn't going to be rushed or intimidated, not in her own home. By the time she reached the front porch, Linda was already in full lecture mode, pacing back and forth while Frank stood with his arms crossed, unmoved by her theatrical display. Grace, this has to stop. Madison has been through hell this past week. She's been seeing a therapist. She's been trying to make things right, and she's ready to apologize. But this legal action is destroying her career, her reputation, her future. You're ruining a young woman's life over what amounts to a misunderstanding. Grace looked past Linda to Madison, who was standing silently by the car, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, her face puffy from crying. For a moment, Grace felt a stab of sympathy for the younger woman. Then she remembered the social media posts, the fraudulent benefit applications, the years of criticism and entitlement. Madison, Grace said quietly, ignoring Linda entirely. Do you have something you want to say to me? Madison stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly. Grace, I want to apologize for everything, for taking the money without asking, for the benefit applications, for the way I've treated you. I know I've been difficult. I know I've taken advantage of your kindness. Go on. I was scared. Madison's voice broke. When Caleb was born, I was so scared of doing everything wrong. My mother always handled everything perfectly, and I didn't know how to be the kind of mother she was. So when you came to help, I thought if I just followed all the experts' advice, if I controlled everything, I could be good enough. But I ended up controlling you instead of learning from you. Grace felt something shift in her chest, not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition. Fear could make people do terrible things, could twist love into manipulation and gratitude into resentment. Madison, what you're describing isn't an excuse, it's an explanation, and I appreciate your honesty. But recognizing why you did something harmful doesn't undo the harm. I know, I've withdrawn all the benefit applications, and I'm paying back every cent. I've told my boss the truth about what happened. I'm in therapy to work on my anxiety and control issues. I've told Eric that we need to hire proper childcare instead of expecting you to sacrifice your lives for us. Linda stepped forward, clearly impatient with Madison's measured approach. Grace, she's trying to make this right. What more do you want? She's apologized. She's making restitution. She's getting help. Isn't it time to forgive and move forward? Grace turned to face Linda fully for the first time. Linda, let me ask you something. When Madison was growing up, when she made mistakes, what were the consequences? I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. Linda's jaw tightened. Madison was a good child. She rarely made serious mistakes. But when she did, we talked about it. We made sure she understood why it was wrong. And then we moved on. There was no point in dwelling on mistakes. Grace nodded slowly. So Madison learned that mistakes were things you could talk your way out of, that apologies were magic words that erased consequences, that if you felt bad enough about doing something wrong, that feeling was punishment enough. Grace, you're being unfair, Madison said. I know what I did was wrong. I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything. I'm trying to make amends. Madison, making amends isn't the same as avoiding consequences. You committed fraud. You damaged my credit, my reputation, my sense of security. You took advantage of legal documents I signed in good faith to help my family. These are not mistakes. They're deliberate actions that had serious consequences for me. So what do you want? Linda demanded. How long are you going to punish her? What will it take for you to forgive? Grace was quiet for a long moment, looking between the two women who stood before her, one demanding, one pleading, both expecting her to be the one to bend, to accommodate, to make things easier for everyone else. Linda, forgiveness isn't something I owe anyone. It's something I choose to give when I'm ready, if I'm ever ready. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending things didn't happen or going back to the way things were. She turned to Madison. You want to make amends, then prove that you've actually changed. Learn to be a mother without criticizing the people who try to help you. Learn to be a wife without expecting your husband's parents to subsidize your lifestyle. Learn to be an adult without using other people as your safety net. How long will that take? Madison asked, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. Maybe years, maybe forever. But Madison, that's not my problem to solve. That's yours. Grace watched as understanding dawned in Madison's eyes, the realization that this wasn't a negotiation, that there was no magic combination of words or actions that would restore their relationship to what it had been. I need you both to leave now, Grace said quietly. And I need you to understand that if you contact me again, if you call, text, email, or show up at my home, I will consider it harassment and contact the police. As Linda and Madison drove away, Grace felt something she hadn't expected: sadness. Not regret she knew she'd made the right choice, but grief for the relationship that might have been, for the family harmony that had never really existed, for the grandmother role she'd loved despite its costs. Frank appeared beside her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist. You okay? I will be, Grace said, leaning into his familiar warmth. I think, for the first time in years, I actually will be. 6 months after Grace and Frank returned to Vermont, they found themselves sitting in a sterile conference room in the Chittenden County Family Court building. David sat beside Grace, a folder of documents on the table before him. Across from them, Eric sat alone. Madison had been excluded from the proceedings at Eric's own request, a development that had surprised everyone, including Eric himself. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Sarah Chin, specialized in family disputes involving grandparents' rights and parental responsibilities. She'd spent the past hour listening to both sides present their cases, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Eric, Dr. Chen said gently, can you help me understand your current situation with Caleb's care? Eric looked exhausted. In the 6 months since Grace had left, he'd aged visibly. His hair had more gray, his face more lines. His shoulders carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I've learned a lot, he said quietly. The first few weeks were rough. I had to take time off work, figure out daycare, learn how to cook meals he'd actually eat. But we're doing okay now. Better than okay, actually. And Madison, Eric's jaw tightened slightly. Madison and I are separated. She's living with her parents while she works through some personal issues. She sees Caleb on weekends. Supervised visits for now. Grace felt a stab of surprise. She'd known from David that Eric and Madison were having problems, but she hadn't realized the separation was official. Eric, Dr. Chen continued, what would you like to see happen with regard to your parents' relationship with Caleb? I want them in his life, Eric said immediately, but I understand now that I can't expect them to be his primary caregivers. I was lazy, I guess. I let them do everything because it was easier than learning how to do it myself. I let Madison criticize them because I was afraid of conflict. I let them pay for things we couldn't afford because I was embarrassed to admit we were struggling. He looked directly at Grace for the first time since entering the room. Mom, I'm not asking you to come back and take care of Caleb. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be his grandmother again, on your terms, whatever those terms are. Grace felt Frank's hand find hers under the table. They talked about this possibility, about what they might be willing to accept if Eric ever truly took responsibility for his role in their family's dysfunction. Eric, Grace said carefully, what does being Caleb's grandmother mean to you? It means Sunday dinners sometimes, if you want. It means him spending a weekend with you once in a while, if you're willing. It means you being at his birthday parties and school plays and soccer games. If you want to be there, it means me calling you for advice about parenting, not me calling you to take over when I don't want to parent. And financially, Eric's face flushed. I'll never ask you for money again. Madison and I are selling the house. It was too expensive anyway. I'm moving into a smaller place that I can afford on my own salary. Caleb and I will figure out our own life. And if we struggle sometimes, that's okay. That's what being an adult means. Dr. Chen made another note. Grace, what are your thoughts on Eric's proposal? Grace was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the little boy who had cried for her during those first difficult weeks, the child who was navigating his parents' divorce and trying to understand why his family had fallen apart. I love Caleb, she said finally. I've always loved him, and nothing that's happened changes that. But Eric, I need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was when I lived in your house. I won't accept criticism of my choices. I won't accept being taken for granted. And I won't sacrifice Frank's and my well-being for anyone else's convenience. Not even for Caleb. I understand. Do you? Because 3 years ago, you said you understood when I told you Madison's criticism hurt my feelings. You said you understood when I explained that we couldn't keep dipping into our retirement fund, but you didn't change anything. Eric nodded slowly. You're right. I said I understood, but I didn't really listen. I thought if I acknowledged what you were saying, that would be enough. I thought you'd just keep going along with whatever we needed because that's what you'd always done. And now I know that love doesn't mean always saying yes. It means respecting people enough to let them say no. Grace looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in years: maturity. The man sitting across from her was finally taking responsibility for his own life, his own choices, his own mistakes. Dr. Chen, Grace said, I'd like to propose a trial period. 3 months where Eric and I rebuild our relationship gradually. Phone calls once a week, one visit per month, here in Vermont, with Caleb staying for a weekend if everyone feels comfortable. No financial support, no emergency child care, no stepping in to solve problems that Eric needs to solve himself. That sounds reasonable, Dr. Chen said. Eric, how does that sound to you? Perfect, Eric said, and for the first time in months, Grace saw him smile. Mom, thank you for everything, for setting boundaries, for not giving up on us completely, for teaching me how to be a better father, even when it was the hardest lesson you could have taught. As they left the courthouse, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope, not for a return to the way things were, but for the possibility of something better, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation, on choice rather than expectation. 1 year after Grace and Frank returned to Vermont, their phone rang on a crisp October morning. Grace was in her kitchen, canning the last of the season's tomatoes, when she saw Eric's name on the caller ID. Their weekly phone calls had become a comfortable routine over the past 9 months, but this was a Tuesday, not their usual Sunday. Hi, Eric. Everything okay? Hi, Mom. Yeah, everything's fine. Great. Actually, I wanted to call and tell you something. His voice carried an excitement Grace hadn't heard in years. Caleb lost his first tooth yesterday. Grace smiled, picturing her grandson's gap-toothed grin. Did the tooth fairy visit? She did, left him a whole dollar, which he thinks makes him rich. But Mom, here's the thing he wants to show you. Not over FaceTime, not in a picture. He wants to drive up to Vermont this weekend and show you in person. Grace felt her heart skip. Caleb had visited them twice since the family mediation. Awkward but sweet weekends where they'd all walked on eggshells, trying to find their new normal. But this was the first time he'd specifically asked to see them. Of course he can come. You're both welcome anytime. Actually, I was wondering if maybe he could stay for a whole weekend. I know that's not what we agreed to originally, but he's been asking about sleeping in Grandma's house and helping Grandpa in the garden. And honestly, I could use the time to finish unpacking the new apartment. Grace looked out her kitchen window at Frank, who was teaching their neighbor's grandson how to split wood, a skill he'd never had the chance to pass on to Eric or Caleb. The sight of him patiently guiding small hands on the axe handle made her chest tighten with longing. Eric, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you asking because you want Caleb to spend time with us, or because you need a break? There was a pause. Both, I guess, but mostly the first one. Mom, he talks about you and Dad all the time. He's got pictures from his visits on his bedroom wall. He's been asking when he can go back to the place with the big garden and the tire swing. And you're okay with him being away from you for a whole weekend. It's hard, Eric admitted. Since Madison and I separated, I've been pretty protective of my time with him, but I'm learning that part of being a good father is letting him have relationships with other people who love him, and I know you love him. We do, very much. So, is that a yes? Grace thought about the guest room upstairs, the one that had sat empty since they'd returned home. She and Frank had talked about turning it into a craft room, but somehow they'd never gotten around to it, as if they'd been unconsciously keeping it ready for this possibility. Yes, Eric, but I want to set some ground rules. Of course. Caleb follows our house rules while he's here. Bedtime, mealtime, chores appropriate for his age. I won't tolerate tantrums or demands for special treatment. And if he misses you and wants to go home early, I call you immediately. Agreed. Dean. And Eric, this doesn't change our arrangement. I'm not becoming his regular babysitter. This is a grandmother having her grandson for a visit. Nothing more. I understand, Mom, and thank you. That Friday afternoon, Grace found herself standing on her front porch, watching Eric's car pull into the driveway. Caleb burst out of the passenger seat before the car had fully stopped, running toward her with his arms outstretched. Grandma, look. He opened his mouth wide, showing off the gap where his front tooth had been. The tooth fairy said I was very brave. Grace knelt down and pulled him into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of his little boy sweetness, mixed with whatever fruity shampoo Eric had been using. You are brave, sweetheart. Very brave. Eric approached more slowly, carrying Caleb's small suitcase. The changes in him over the past year were remarkable. He stood straighter. His clothes fit better. There was a confidence in his manner that hadn't been there when he was constantly worried about managing Madison's expectations. Thanks for this, Mom. I'll pick him up Sunday evening, around 6. That works fine. Grace hesitated, then added, Eric, would you like to stay for dinner? Nothing fancy, just pot roast. Eric's face lit up. I'd love that, if you're sure it's not too much trouble. It's not trouble. As they sat around the kitchen table that evening, Grace, Frank, Eric, and Caleb Grace felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The conversation flowed naturally, Eric asking Frank about his woodworking projects, Caleb chattering about his new school, and his friend Marcus, who had a pet hamster. Daddy, can we get a hamster? Caleb asked around a mouthful of mashed potatoes. We'll see, Eric said automatically, then caught himself. Actually, buddy, let's talk about that. Pets are a big responsibility. We'd need to research what hamsters need, figure out where we'd put the cage, discuss who would feed it every day. Grace watched this exchange with interest. The old Eric would have either said yes immediately to avoid conflict or deferred the decision to Madison. This Eric was actually parenting, thinking through decisions, involving his son in problem solving. After dinner, Caleb helped Frank stack firewood while Eric and Grace cleaned dishes together in comfortable silence. Finally, Eric spoke. Madison's moving back to her parents' house permanently, in California. Grace's hand stilled on the plate she was washing. What does that mean for Caleb? She'll have him for Christmas and spring break, maybe a week in the summer. She's not fighting for more than that. She says she needs time to figure out who she is when she's not trying to be perfect all the time. How do you feel about that? Eric was quiet for a moment. Sad, relieved, guilty about feeling relieved. Caleb's handling it better than I expected. Kids are resilient, I guess. They are, but it's still hard. Yeah, some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water. Other days I feel like Caleb and I are finally becoming a real team. You know, like we're figuring out how to be a family together. Grace turned to look at her son, this man who was learning to navigate single parenthood with grace and determination. Eric, I'm proud of you. I know this hasn't been easy, but you're doing a good job. Eric's eyes filled with tears. Thanks, Mom. That means everything to me. It was Caleb's 7th birthday, and Grace found herself in the familiar chaos of a children's party for the first time in over 2 years. Eric's small apartment was decorated with superhero-themed balloons and streamers, and 6 little boys were running around the living room high on cake and excitement. Grace stood in the kitchen, cutting cake and watching Eric handle the controlled mayhem with surprising competence. He'd planned the entire party himself: games, food, decorations, party favors. The old Eric would have panicked and called her to take over. This Eric had called to invite her to participate, not to manage. Mrs. Whitman, a voice beside her made Grace turn. A young woman with kind eyes and flower in her hair was smiling at her. I'm Sarah, Marcus's mom. Caleb talks about you all the time. Nice to meet you, Sarah. Eric mentioned you live in Vermont now. That must be quite a drive for visits. About 2 hours. Not too bad. Sarah nodded. Caleb's lucky to have grandparents who make that effort. My kids' grandparents live across the country, so they see them maybe once a year. Grace was about to respond when a crash from the living room interrupted them, followed by Eric's calm voice. Okay, guys, let's clean this up together, and then we'll play the next game. He's gotten really good at this, Sarah observed. When Marcus first started playing with Caleb, Eric seemed so overwhelmed by everything. Now he's like, I don't know, he's got his confidence back. Grace watched her son crouch down to help a tearful little boy who'd dropped his piece of cake, speaking to him gently while the other children gathered around to help. There was a patience in Eric's movements, a present-minded focus that she remembered from his own childhood but had somehow lost along the way. He's learning, Grace said quietly. After the party, after the other children had been picked up and the apartment had been restored to some semblance of order, Caleb curled up in Grace's lap while Eric and Frank loaded the dishwasher together. Grandma, Caleb said sleepily, why don't you live with us anymore? It was the question Grace had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. She looked down at her grandson, his dark hair tousled from the afternoon's activities, his face serious with the weight of things he was trying to understand. Sweetheart, grown-ups have their own houses where they live with the people they're married to. Daddy lives here because this is his house. Grandpa and I live in Vermont because that's our house. But you used to live here. I did, for a while, but that was different. That was when Daddy needed extra help taking care of you. Now, Daddy's really good at taking care of you all by himself. Caleb was quiet for a moment, processing this. Are you ever going to live with us again? Grace felt Frank's eyes on her from across the room, felt the weight of everyone waiting for her answer. The truth was complex that she'd learned the difference between loving someone and sacrificing yourself for them, that she'd discovered the importance of boundaries even within families, that she'd found peace in a life that belonged to her again. No, sweetheart. Grandpa and I are going to keep living in our own house, but that doesn't mean we don't love you or that we won't see you. It just means we love you from our house, and you and Daddy love us from your house. Like Marcus and his grandparents. Exactly like that. Caleb seemed satisfied with this explanation, settling more deeply into her lap. Can I come visit you again soon? Whenever Daddy says it's okay and you want to come? As they drove home to Vermont that evening, Frank reached over and took Grace's hand. That was good? What you told him? I hope so. I worry sometimes that I'm being selfish, that I'm punishing him for his parents' mistakes. Grace, look at that little boy. Does he seem punished to you? Grace thought about Caleb at the party, confident, happy, clearly adored by his father and comfortable with the adults around him. He'd had moments of sadness when other children mentioned their mothers, but he'd also shown a resilience and adaptability that spoke to his fundamental security. No, she said finally, he doesn't. Kids need consistency and love. They don't need martyrs. Grace squeezed Frank's hand, watching the familiar landscape of Vermont hills roll past in the gathering dusk. They were going home not to a cramped guest room where they walked on eggshells, but to their own house, their own bed, their own life that they'd reclaimed through the painful but necessary act of saying no. Love, Grace had learned, wasn't about how much you were willing to sacrifice. It was about caring enough to insist that everyone in the relationship, including yourself, be treated with dignity and respect. It was about teaching by example that boundaries weren't walls meant to keep people out, but foundations strong enough to support healthy relationships. As they pulled into their driveway, Grace saw the lights they'd left on in the kitchen window, welcoming them home. Tomorrow, she would call Eric to thank him for including them in Caleb's birthday. Next month, Caleb would come for another visit. In the spring, they might all go fishing together at the lake. It wasn't the relationship she'd once imagined having with her son and grandson. It was better. It was built on choice rather than obligation, respect rather than resentment, love that was freely given rather than extracted through guilt. Grace had spent 3 years learning that the most loving thing you could sometimes do was walk away. Now she was learning something equally important, that it was possible to walk back, as long as you walked back to something different, something healthier, something real. As she and Frank climbed the stairs to their bedroom, their own bedroom, in their own house, Grace felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed. She had been a devoted mother, a sacrificing grandmother, a woman who gave until she had nothing left to give. Now she was simply Grace, a woman who loved her family enough to teach them that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was a slow form of destruction that diminished everyone it touched. The boundaries she'd drawn weren't walls. They were the foundation upon which a new kind of love could grow stronger because it was chosen, deeper because it was honest, and more sustainable because it honored the humanity of everyone involved. Some bridges, once burned, could be rebuilt, but they had to be built differently the second time, with stronger materials and better engineering, designed to carry the weight of mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Zenditang. Grace smiled as she turned off the bedside lamp, listening to Frank's steady breathing beside her and the familiar sounds of their own home settling around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the art of loving with boundaries. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged.